Good evening. I'm Simon Nightingale, Chair of Shropshire Humanists, and it is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, my friend Peter Pack. Peter has been a member of Amnesty International for over 43 years, and between 1991 and 2007 made a sustained contribution to the volunteer leadership of this international movement, including chairing the worldwide board during the 2007 and 2011 period. Since 1994, he has produced a monthly international issues newsletter on internal AI policy developments that is circulated to many countries and translated into various languages. We're very fortunate to have him speaking to us this evening. Peter, welcome.
My day job is as a maths teacher and a deputy head. My interest in these sorts of issues comes from a long involvement with Amnesty International. I joined the organisation as a student at the end of the 1970s, and from 2007 to 11 I was the chair of the International Board. So I learned quite a lot about human rights issues between those times. And what I'm going to do this evening, Simon's asked me to talk for about half an hour. I'll do my best to stick to that, is talk about the changing nature of authoritarianism and how the world needs to respond to that. I think if you watch the tragedy that's unfolding in Ukraine, it prompts many questions, and one of them is, how do authoritarian leaders such as President Putin hold on to power? 2 decades ago, if you asked that question about Saddam Hussein, the answer would have been very straightforward. It was sheer terror. But at least until the beginning of this year, Putin was in many ways an example of the changing nature of authoritarianism in the 21st century, because he was a leader who largely, not entirely of course, but largely kept violence in the background and only drew on it when his preferred techniques for shaping public opinion failed to work sufficiently well. So what I'd like to do in this talk is talk about the distinction between what one might call fear dictators and spin dictators. Those who, on the one hand, rely overwhelmingly on brute force, and those, on the other hand, who rely primarily on the techniques of public relations while resorting to force when necessary. And before I should go any further, I should say that I'm very much speaking tonight in a purely personal capacity. Although I've got an association with Amnesty International and that motivated my interest, I'm definitely not here to put Amnesty International's position. And what I'm talking about is largely based on this book that came out last year and some other books I've read around the topic and a number of reviews that I've looked at of the book. So if we just start off with pictures of some classic dictators, you could brand these all as fear dictators, really, because the main characteristics of their rule were the use of large-scale extreme violence, supported by secret police, often sealed national borders, a thorough climate of fear, comprehensive control over public communications, including all mass media, and no pretense whatsoever of democracy. Just as one example, in 1984, the elections to the Supreme Soviet, for example, reported 99.94% support for the Communist Party. Now, nobody was supposed to actually believe that number. The point was that people were supposed to conclude that the all-powerful party had complete impunity to present the incredible as the real. In the same way as you may remember in those days, 100% of Soviet planes and aircraft always worked perfectly, and there were never any fatalities. There were no plane crashes in the Soviet Union. There were no serious accidents of any sort. Those who dared to disagree knew that they couldn't leave the country, and they ended up risking a prison sentence or detention in a psychiatric hospital, where a typical diagnosis would have been that the patient was suffering from reformist delusions. Now, in contrast to these people here who relied essentially on shooting their opponents in very large numbers, if you look at more recent dictators, by and large, those who have emerged in the last 30 years or so, rely much more on their ability to shape public opinion than on the explicit use of violent repression, although they always use that as a fallback when necessary. Now, until fairly recently, well, until February really, President Putin fitted fairly well into this category. Unlike the leaders who ran the USSR, he did allow some opposition media in print, in broadcasting and on the internet. And in fact, one of the leading opposition media figures in Russia won the Nobel Peace Prize last time round. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. Morozov, or a name along those lines. And he also, Putin has allowed some opposition politicians to be elected to the Duma, to other local positions, and Alexei Navalny continued to be able to be active. However constrained he was, however serious the attempts to poison him, he wasn't simply taken out and shot, as would have certainly happened under Stalin, for example. Indeed, one of Putin's means of public control is precisely that he has allowed elections to take place and have the semblance of propriety and democracy about them. So rather than 99.94%, if you look at the 2018 Russian presidential elections, the official turnout, as described by the Kremlin, was only 67.5%, and only 77.5% of the votes came to Putin. So he actually was only claiming that about 52% of the electorate had voted for him. So these numbers were low enough for him to be able to claim that they were legitimate, although of course he had worked very hard behind the scenes to make sure they were not legitimate at all. Now that election wasn't free and fair. There were very strict limits on the apparent choice of candidates who could run. There were strict controls on the activism of political opponents and on the reporting of the campaign by independent media and publications. But they do illustrate how a spin dictator can aim for a surface of democratic legitimacy, while straightforward thugs make no pretense to do so. In other words, it shows, I think, how the main method of a spin dictator is to shape public opinion rather than to use violent repression as their first port of call. They're using deception followed by intimidation with the use of force as a reserve. So, for example, Putin certainly has been responsible for the deaths of opposition activists. Some of you may remember the opposition politician Boris Nemtsov, who was shot dead on Red Square, almost certainly on Putin's orders, and similarly the extremely brave investigative journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who again was assassinated clearly on his say-so. But 2 or 3 cases like that compared to 200,000 or 300,000 cases of people being exterminated under Stalin for political crimes, say, there is an order of magnitude, many orders of magnitude difference in the scale of violence being perpetrated by different authoritarian leaders of different types. Now, this change of approach has been pretty widespread across the world. So, if we have a look here, proportions of dictatorships, loosely those using coercion as their first port of call, the fear dictators, versus those who are using more sophisticated methods to simulate democracy, the spin dictators. You can see over about the last 30 years, there's been a very significant change around the world. And that change has largely happened, I suppose, since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Now, the next couple of slides just show what this means in practice. So, for one thing, what we have here is a steady rise. Now, this is in non-democracies of elections of one sort or another. So we have an increasing proportion of dictators holding some kind of sham election or another because they want to try to persuade internal and external audiences that they have democratic legitimacy, even though they don't. And the 3 different lines are showing 3 different types of election. But I think if you look at the overall trend, more elections are happening because more of them are being rigged, unfortunately. Similarly, if you look at, it's a very crude measure, and the authors of the book provide plenty of other data to support this trend, but if you simply look at those who kill their political opponents, it's about as crude a yardstick as you can get. But it does show pretty clearly that those numbers are dropping off. So increasingly, dictators are moving away from killing their opponents to other ways of managing their domestic publics and keeping opposition under control. Now, before going into a bit more detail about exactly what sort of techniques are being used by dictatorships, I think it's worth saying that the distinction between spin and fear dictators is something of an idealisation. Those are obviously two extremes, and there are going to be plenty of cases that lie somewhere in the middle, where there is a mixture of fear and propaganda and public relations. So, for example, again, if we go back a little bit in history, Hitler clearly had no qualms whatsoever about extreme violence in numerous circumstances, but also propaganda was very important to him. This is a still from the film Triumph of the Will. It's described as a documentary usually, but that's really misleading because it was made as a propaganda film on behalf of Hitler and the Nazi Party. And if you watch it, it's still really scary for the way it whips up opinion, particularly extreme nationalist sentiment, and the notion that anyone who isn't an Aryan is a second-class person who hardly deserves to exist. So I wouldn't want to say that there is all dictators either fall into one category or another, or that this category of spin is entirely new, but the balance has certainly shifted. That's really the important point. So if we go back to present day now, we think about, well, what are the techniques that dictators, authoritarians are using if they're not using straightforward violence? How are they retaining their hold on power? And I think there are 8 main techniques which are listed here. So the first one is to be genuinely popular. I put genuinely in quote marks because you could argue about how genuine it is. But if you, for example, look at those that have delivered good economic performance, the Chinese Communist Party has delivered something like 7 to 10% growth in GDP for probably 2 decades now. So there's been an extraordinary increase in the material living standards of people in China. And it must be the case that a fair number of Chinese people are willing to go along with the downsides of living in a one-party state because their material standard of living has increased in quite extraordinary ways over the last 20 to 25 years. So delivering good economic performance certainly is one ingredient that can be used by authoritarians. On the other hand, if you look at somewhere like North Korea, its GDP has actually contracted over the last 10 years pretty steadily, and that's probably why Kim Jong-un very much remains a fear dictator, because he hasn't got any other tools in his toolkit, really. And secondly, and probably related to the first one, there's the notion of cultivating an image of technocratic competence and expertise, often mixed with nationalism, and using these to claim responsibility for your country's successes. Because what's noticeable about most of the authoritarians nowadays is they don't really have a strong ideology. What they have instead is claims to competence of one form or another and claims to deliver. So I suppose it's the ideology of delivery, if you like, the ideology of pragmatism, rather than the more traditional notion, again, if you look at North Korea, of someone who has a very orthodox sense of being a democratic people's republic and having all the ideological baggage that goes with that. Until recently, if you take another example, perhaps a bit closer to home, if you look at President Erdogan in Turkey, until quite recently, he was able to weave together also a tale of strong economic development, modernisation, investment in infrastructure, and a strong nationalist narrative. Now, more recently, that's rather fallen apart, and I think 80% is the current inflation rate in Turkey, the Turkish currency collapsing, and so on. But nonetheless, until relatively recently, Erdogan has had a number of other tools to pull on, and although he has used force where necessary, that hasn't been his primary means of retaining power. The third thing to do is, if you're going to claim the successes as yours, is you always blame somebody else for the failures. Of course, that's not unique to dictators, it's also true of democratic politicians. Probably true of most of us in our work, day-to-day work, but it's a matter of degree, I think. So if you look at Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, for example, he consistently blame all of Venezuela's problems on the USA, on its sanctions and so on. Now, undoubtedly the USA was responsible for some of the country's ills, but not for everything. And Maduro has taken over from him, has adopted that line. If you look elsewhere in Latin America, President Fujimori in Peru, for example, put a lot of energy into attacking his enemies, blaming them for holding back the country's development. President Orban, close to home in Hungary, again, is forever criticising outsiders for undermining civic values in Hungary. He closed down the Central European University in Budapest, for example, because he thought it was bringing in toxic foreign ideas and so on. A fourth technique that works because so many of these authoritarians operate in a kind of ideology-free zone is simply to bribe opposition members to change sides. Because if you're living in a country where politics is primarily seen as a means to enrichment, then it's quite easy to simply buy the loyalty of political opponents and co-opt them to your side. And that's a technique that's relatively straightforward. Number 5, as I mentioned already, pretending to be democratic is really important. Most countries are democratic around the world. Here we are. And those that are not, generally nowadays, try to pretend to be democratic. There are very few that boast about not being democratic. So most pretend, and they therefore, in order to make that pretense at least partly plausible, they don't censor everything in the way that censorship used to work. They don't block all independent media. They don't prevent all opposition parties from functioning. They don't deny access to all journalists, and so on. They allow some of this activity to happen, but make sure that it's kept at a low enough level that it's not a threat to their authority. So, for example, again, if you look at Russia, until fairly recently, President Putin has turned quite a blind eye to a lot of what happens on the internet, on social media, because he's concluded, and he seems to have been correct in this regard, that the vast majority of the Russian population are getting their news and information from television, and if a few percent pick things up on social media, well, they're not going to coalesce into an opposition to him, and he can say to the outside world, what do you mean I censor things? I allow all this stuff to happen on Telegram and so on. And leading on from that, point number 6 is to try to divide the informed public from the mass public. So again, the analogy there, or the example there of Russia, works quite well. Spin dictators, rather like populists in fact in real democracies, often work by a divide and rule approach, encouraging the majority of the population to take against their political opponents by branding those opponents as elitist or unpatriotic or self-interested, and by inflaming cultural conflicts. The 7th technique is to manipulate and use your popularity to consolidate power by manipulating those institutions that are intended to preserve checks and balances. So many countries have written constitutions, for example, where those who gain more than 2/3 or sometimes 75% of the votes can make changes to the constitution and justify those on the grounds that they are reflecting the will of the people. The most obvious way of doing this is when authoritarians seek to have term limits removed. Now, sometimes they don't feel confident about doing that, and they find other ways around it. So again, if you think of Putin, you may remember a few years ago when his 2 terms were up, he did a swap with Dmitry Medvedev, and Medvedev became the president, Putin was the prime minister, I think for 4 years, and then they swapped over and the terms continued. But in a number of other countries, so Egypt, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Uganda, and Venezuela are a few examples where authoritarians have pushed through changes to relax term limits or to have them reinterpreted as starting at a different time. And then the last technique that is frequently used by spin authoritarians is to undermine critics by using plausible but really spurious or sometimes completely bogus charges. And the most common ones are to claim that your political opponents are guilty of tax evasion or fraud, and you can try to force your political opponents out that way. If that doesn't work, then you resort to some of the other techniques. But just to give a couple of examples, Alexei Navalny was accused at one point of illegal elk hunting. This is the way of getting him locked up for a bit. And in Kazakhstan, opposition journalists have frequently been accused of money laundering. That seems to be the Kazakh government's preferred way of getting rid of its opponents and getting them locked up. In Turkey, Erdogan has quite often claimed that opposition politicians were evading military service. And, you know, you can look around and you can find other examples of that sort. So these are the kinds of behaviour that are typical of spin dictators, but relatively rare amongst those who are simply relying on brute force. And they're rare amongst those who rely on brute force because they simply don't allow any opposition. You think back to, for example, how Colonel Gaddafi used to run Libya. He simply used to shoot people who disagreed with him. Ones who weren't shot would be detained in prison underneath his palace for many years. And I think at one point there was an uprising in the prison underneath his palace, and something like 1,000 prisoners were simply shot dead in a day by his security guards. If you look at what happens in Syria today, again another old-style dictator, Bashar al-Assad, or in North Korea, there is absolutely no allowance whatsoever for any kind of opposition, party, independent media, blogging, or anything of the sort. So these techniques are simply irrelevant if you rule out any kind of opposition from the outset. Having said that, there are obviously some countries that it's quite hard to classify. So maybe 10 or 15% of dictators are pure fear dictators these days, maybe around 50% are spin dictators, and the rest are somewhere in the middle. So countries like Laos or Qatar or United Arab Emirates, you could say fit in the middle. Qatar is really an absolute monarchy, but it just brands itself as progressive. And the same with the UAE, really. Qatar has an absolutely terrible human rights record, but it projects an image to the outside world of progressive modernisation, hosting the World Cup, and so on, as one example of doing so. Other countries are also can be harder to classify. So if you think about China or Saudi Arabia, on the one hand, both of them have got really ruthless repression of political opponents and very sophisticated use of internet and digital technologies to control their populations. But they also present a front, in some ways, of flexibility and modernisation, which really relies on using a lot of these techniques. And again, you can sort of see just how different they are to the classic fear dictatorship. It's, I think, next week, 70 years since the show trial in Prague, November 1952 show trial, which was mirrored by other show trials in Warsaw and in Moscow. But the Prague ones, I think, are quite well known. 14 members of the Czech Communist Party leadership of the time, including Rudolf Slansky, appeared in court, accused of all sorts of preposterous crimes. 11 of them were executed, and I think the remaining 3 were sent to prison for life. Now, that sort of orchestrated use of extreme violence just doesn't really happen really anywhere, I would say, anymore. Certainly it's not publicised in that way, because there, the show trial was a show in the sense it was meant to be seen by the people in the country as a warning for people who step out of line. So an obvious question to ask, I suppose, is why has there been such a shift in the nature of authoritarianism in the last 30 years? What has happened to cause this move away from the use of absolute force to a range of other techniques for holding on to power in a completely undemocratic way? There are a number of different explanations that different authors put forward, and I'll just go through what seem to be the main 4 or 5. So the first one is simply that by and large, there has been a general drop-off in armed conflict around the world and a reduction in the role of the military in many countries. So here, for example, you can see the state of conscription around the world. The red shows countries where there is full conscription, and you can see it's pretty rare. So very few citizens, as a result, in most countries nowadays, have direct experience of organised violence and preparation for its use. There's less brutalisation generally in societies. I think Steven Pinker, some of you may know, produced a book about 5 or 6 years ago now, charting this kind of secular decline in the level of violence in almost all areas of society, in almost all countries in recent decades. And as a result, it's simply more difficult for dictators to draw on a pool of people who are trained to use force in a systematic and very violent manner, because they just aren't there. The second factor that has been used to explain this changing nature of authoritarianism is the changing nature of society from industrial to post-industrial society. Many more people working in cities rather than the countryside, working with information rather than on production lines, needing to be creative, and having to think when they work, using quite high levels of education. So a former dictator in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, is quoted as saying, "One cannot ask a highly educated workforce to stop thinking when it leaves the factory." And the point he was making, therefore, was that you have to have quite sophisticated ways of managing people who are better educated. You can't simply rely on brute force. And again, if you look at Russia, for example, the proportion of the population with higher education was 2% in 1950 and is about 25% today. So there's a really significant demographic change, and leaders need to respond somehow to those demographic changes, because you just can't run a modern society without employing large numbers of people who are relatively open-minded graduates. The third big change, of course, has been globalisation over the last quarter century. Pretty much all countries now do a lot of trade with the external world, and this simply can't be done whilst maintaining complete isolation from the external world. Similarly, the internet has opened up most countries to a vast amount of communication with the outside world. As a result, it's very difficult to keep truth out of the country. In the USSR, every incident that conflicted with the official narrative was suppressed. Today, it's much harder to do that. So if you think about the explosion on the Kerch Bridge a couple of weeks ago, simply impossible to keep that a secret. China's probably an exception in this regard because they've kind of built their great firewall. But even then, they're not totally impermeable by any means, and certainly the outside world seems to find out a fair amount of what's going on. There's a good quote from a former president of Ivory Coast who was a ghastly thug, and he said, "We're having to carry out our own French Revolution with Amnesty International peering over our shoulder." I think was a compliment to Amnesty. Because what's happened really is the creation of organisations like Amnesty International, the development of the United Nations varied agencies, a range of international treaties against torture on the small arms trade and so on, the imposition of aid conditionality by the European Union and other big donors, ethical foreign policies started probably by President Jimmy Carter, extended by various other leaders. Some of you remember in this country when Robin Cook was the Foreign Secretary, he promised an ethical foreign policy and so on. All of these put a lot of pressure on dictators to appear to be behaving more reasonably and less violently. If they can't be seen to use violence, they can't be seen to be using violence or to be too blatant in fixing their elections. So that's why they tend generally to report that they've won by margins in the 60% or 70%, not in the high 90%. They need to develop more subtle techniques to hang on to power. And then lastly, I think the end of the Cold War has made quite a difference, because it's made it much harder for dictators to stay in office by simply playing off East versus West. If you think back to the days of the Cold War, it was possible, for example, in Africa for dictators in various countries to get away with almost anything by either siding with the West or siding with the Soviet Union. And that's just not possible anymore. It's probably only still true in the Middle East, where dictators can play the sort of enemy's enemy is my friend card. But even there, other than Syria, it's proving quite difficult for them, I think. Whereas in the past, in most areas, not just Africa, but you think Latin America as well, it was possible for really vicious military dictatorships to get away with appalling crimes simply by saying we're anti-communist. Now, any reduction, it seems to me, in unjustified violence is welcome. So, other things being equal, if people are in charge are less brutal, that is progress of a sort. Clearly, it would be more progress and more welcome news if the dictatorships moved to democracies, but nonetheless, moving from fear dictatorships to spin dictatorships is progress in some ways, but it does pose two quite big challenges, I think, for the human rights movement, both within countries and internationally. The first one is it's simply become much harder to separate truth from fiction, reality from fake news. Again, if you think of the extreme cases of Iraq under Saddam Hussein, for example, nobody really doubted what he was up to, and there wasn't really any pretense about it. It was clear that any official messages coming from Baghdad were 100% false, and it was clear what his wrongdoing consisted of. We all knew about him starting the war against Iran, attempting to eliminate the Marsh Arabs, gassing the Kurds, invading Kuwait. So there was no debate about how bad he was. There was plenty of debate, of course, about what to do about it, but in terms of what his track record was, it was indisputable, really. So the challenge there was to find methods that might succeed against the fear dictators, and then to persuade perhaps the sceptical public that any such actions were more than futile gestures. Today, it's become much harder to discern what is true from what is false. So here's an example from earlier this year, from Hungary. Now, personally, I don't doubt that Viktor Orban did rig the Hungarian general election results earlier this year. I think he made it very difficult for opposition parties to gain equal coverage in their national media. He made it hard for opposition media to function fully, and he seems to have had an undue influence on the drawing of constituency boundaries. But he, of course, could point out that in plenty of democracies, in fact, in any democracy that doesn't use proportional representation, the winning party often ends up with a majority of seats in Parliament on a minority of the vote, or ends up with a much bigger share of seats in Parliament than its share of the vote. So I think it's actually not as easy to make a case against Orban as against Saddam Hussein or Colonel Gaddafi, for example, because you do actually have to know quite a lot more about what's going on. You have to look in a lot more detail to determine the wrongness of his actions. Or to take an easier comparison, really, if you compare Orban with János Kádár, who came to power after the tanks went in 1956 in Budapest, there was no question that Kádár obtained power through sheer force. It was the Soviet tanks that got him into power. It's harder to argue the case against Orban without going into a lot more detail, and if you're trying to persuade somebody, you need to spend a lot more time persuading them and showing them what's going on. So the same holds true in many other places where authoritarian leaders are using the cloak of democratic means for holding on to power. Another example I think that's quite good is from Turkey. President Erdogan claimed that there was an attempted coup in 2016 organised by the so-called Gulenist movement, led by a preacher called Gulen who actually lives in the United States. Now, it's far from easy for outsiders to tell exactly how much truth there is to this claim. It does probably seem correct that there was some sort of coup attempt, but the extent to which the Turkish government, in its response, was responding to the coup, as opposed to using it, or the coup attempt, let's say, or using it as a pretext to round up all of its political opponents, that's much, much harder to establish. Plenty of reliable sources do suggest that President Erdogan used the failed coup as a pretext to round up vast numbers of his political opponents, regardless of whether they had any connection or not with the coup. But it is also true, undoubtedly, that some of those who were arrested definitely did have an involvement in the coup. I think only the most Machiavellian actually suggests that he somehow organised the coup against himself as a pretext for arresting his opponents. But that kind of just illustrates the fact that how difficult it is sometimes to establish the truth. A different sort of example, from earlier this year, the Polish government was widely criticised for attempting to change the political balance of judges in the country's highest courts by introducing term limits and mandatory retirement ages for judges. Again, campaigning against those sorts of changes needs a considerable amount of research skill to establish the facts and their significance. Because superficially, most of us might think, well, actually, it's not such a bad idea to have a fixed retirement age for judges or for other public servants, perhaps. So this brings us to the second challenge. If the facts are harder to establish, then it's also harder to explain the concerns to internal and external audiences and to motivate them to take action. In Amnesty International, for example, we often ask members of the public to write to governments opposing the use of torture, the death penalty, or the detention of prisoners of conscience. Those are straightforward cases, by and large. It's considerably harder to persuade people to write on issues such as gerrymandering of election boundaries, retirement ages of judges, the use of facial recognition technology, or the curtailment of internet freedoms. I don't think there are easy solutions to these problems, but I do think we should be grateful that an increasing number of specialist organisations, such as fact-checking outfits or the digital forensics people at Bellingcat, for example, are really doing their best to sift the truth from falsehood. And it seems to me important that everybody defends and supports their work. I think it's also interesting that the BBC, for example, now has journalists who are described as their disinformation correspondents, who specialise in investigations and in reporting this sort of work. So having talked about the main factors that have led to dictatorships changing their nature and largely replacing fear by spin up to now, namely reductions in armed conflict, the rise of the knowledge economy, globalisation, the emergence of the liberal world order and the end of the Cold War, it's worth thinking about what the future might hold. It seems plausible that if these factors continue, then the trends will also continue. But if they dissipate, the trends might reverse. Unfortunately, these factors do seem to be slowing down. There are, for example, pretty serious armed conflicts currently, not just in Ukraine, but in Yemen. That civil war hasn't gone away. You might have noticed there's been a nasty war between Ethiopia and Eritrea that's run on for most of the last year. I think we're now in the 8th or possibly 9th year of the civil war in Syria. Again, you may have seen in the news that the French have decided to pull out of Africa, North Africa, because their attempts to keep Islamic fundamentalist terrorists under control in Chad, Niger and Mali appear to be failing. There's been a coup in at least one of those countries quite recently. Iraq is still a complete mess and very violent. There was a small war between Armenia and Azerbaijan not that long ago, and so on. So armed conflict hasn't disappeared and does seem to be coming back. Globalisation is very much under attack from nationalists of various sorts in many countries. Brexit, I think, was one local manifestation of this. And leaders such as China's President Xi Jinping, Orban in Hungary, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, and so on, are really doing their best to undermine the notion of a rules-based international order. So there are some negatives there. On the other hand, I think it is quite interesting that it's not so straightforward for spin dictators to move back to simply using fear. So if you look at Russia over the last 9 months or so, certainly the government is using much more thuggery now than it was in January. The media have been further restricted. Laws curtailing free speech have been considerably enlarged. But in spite of those changes, it's striking that Alexei Navalny is still alive. It's remarkable that that very brave journalist, Marina, I'll try and pronounce her name, Ovsyannikova, the one who held up the protest banner on Russian TV, Channel 1, she was fined $150. She was released, she went to Germany, she worked for the newspaper Die Welt for a little while, and then for reasons that aren't clear, she went back to Russia. She carried out another protest, the solo protest in the middle of Red Square, got arrested and is currently under house arrest. But she's still alive, and she was allowed to travel in and out of the country. When the partial mobilisation was announced in late September, Russia's borders weren't sealed, and a surprisingly large amount of criticism has circulated about that decision and the conduct of the war on social media. And a number of commentators have suggested that President Putin does actually appear to feel that he needs to assuage the demands of ultranationalists rather than himself being in complete political control of the information space in Russia. So all of that suggests that shifting back to sheer force is actually not that straightforward. So if you're looking for small grounds for optimism, that might be one. But it's not that easy to reverse these processes. I suppose a related question to what might happen in the future is to ask, what about the balance between democracies and non-democracies? So if we have a look at the changing nature of the ratio of democracies to non-democracies, you can see that until about 2000, democracies seem to be winning out over non-democratic government around the world. But in the last 15 years or so, the picture has been much more mixed, with democracy itself on something of a back foot. And I think this chimes with what most of us have seen in the news, in the USA, Brazil, India, Hungary, Poland, and so on. There have all been significant growths in undemocratic trends. Populists in those countries, as well as France, Italy, Austria, Spain, and so on, have typically claimed they have simple solutions to the country's ills, that elite groups are standing in their way, and that implementing the so-called will of the people therefore requires the removal of barriers such as independent regulators, courts, and the media. And that may be part of the problem that is trust-based. But in a sense, she also thought that getting rid of barriers like OBR, accountability, and so on, was something that she could simply sweep away on the basis of the will of her electorate and should become proper. So it's when these sorts of claims are made that alarm bells begin to ring. There is a danger of the gap between actual and sham democracies narrowing as dictators become ever more skilled in manipulating their publics, whilst unscrupulous politicians in democracies resort to fake news and other techniques that undermine the inconvenient checks and balances necessary for democracies to work well. Probably worth making a bit of a comment about the UK. Boris Johnson was clearly someone who had no interest in respecting written or unwritten conventions and played fast and loose with the rule of law when he could. But it's also striking, I think, that in spite of those attitudes, he was forced out by ordinary political pressure from MPs and ministers deserting him, after widespread negative media coverage, formal inquiry by Sue Gray, and a range of legal challenges. And in the end, he didn't really put up much of a fight. An authoritarian would at the very least have gone to Graham Brady and said, change the rules so that I can't be ousted. So I do think it's worth drawing a distinction between people we might find unattractive with a democratic polity and those who actually are authoritarian and really do hold on to power. That doesn't mean we should get complacent, but it also means we shouldn't underestimate significant differences between unattractive politicians in democracies and genuine authoritarians in non-democracies. A couple of things in conclusion, it seems to me, are probably worth saying. As I mentioned, I think opposing authoritarianism is paradoxically becoming both harder and easier. It's becoming harder because more skill is needed to identify it. Separating out fake news from the truth is often not entirely straightforward. And then persuading the wider public to understand which is also hard. But once that has been achieved, the spin dictator is vulnerable in more ways than the traditional fear dictator. For a start, travel in and out of their country is often permissible. There are typically some independent media that can be supported and encouraged. There are some relatively independent political organisations. There are pressures that can be brought to bear by international financial institutions and so on. So there are more points of pressure than for someone who is simply a fear dictator and an isolationist and who is prepared to remain in that situation. The second conclusion, I think, is to think about the trend from fear to spin dictatorships, a trend which has undoubtedly saved many lives, even if it hasn't brought about a direct increase in human freedom, and what other governments should be doing to try to maintain that trend. It seems to me that protecting and reforming the institutions of the liberal world order is a prerequisite for continuing to see that change from fear to spin. But in order to do that, democracies do need to keep their own houses in order. And as we've seen in recent years, in a number of countries, including our own, democracies have looked a bit shaky at times. I think the other point is really to emphasise the need for respect for checks and balances, independent institutions, and free media. It's probably also necessary to continue to encourage authoritarians to continue with the sorts of modernisation that increase movement of people across borders, that raise educational standards, and that encourage independence of thought, even when it seems counterintuitive to do so, and when sanctions seem a more appropriate option. Nowhere, I think, will that dilemma be more difficult than when Western governments in due course have to decide how to deal with Russia. Because on the one hand, we're almost certainly going to want to maintain severe sanctions. On the other hand, there has to be a risk of sanctions driving countries further into isolation, and as they go further into isolation, making it easier for their authoritarian leaders to justify their existence by claiming the world is ganging up on them. And I suppose a good model there might be Iran, which has been very cut off from the outside world for a very long time by a wide range of sanctions. One would like to think that the extraordinarily brave schoolgirls who are rising up against the government that have been in the last few weeks will lead to permanent change, but one certainly can't count on it, and it's not obvious, I think, whether the cumulative effect of all those sanctions has actually been to help the people of Iran or not. It's a wonderful place to stop. Thank you for listening.
Oh, my head is spinning. So, after the talk, what we usually do is stop for about 5 minutes, stretch our legs, have a cup of coffee, and then I'll call everybody back to their seats and we'll have questions and answers. So, help yourself to coffee, take your cup with you. Questions? Well,
On the question of conscription, have the Russians introduced conscription again?
so you asked whether the Russians have introduced conscription again.
Yes, that's right. So I think it was on the 26th of September, President Putin announced a partial conscription. And then I think a couple of days ago, he said that conscription would end within the next few days. But it seems to have not worked very well from his perspective, which is probably a good thing. It's generated a very considerable amount of discontent within Russia. It's particularly been focused on those regions with large ethnic populations, and has therefore set different parts of Russia against each other. It's brought in large numbers of people who are completely untrained, who are often too elderly to fight effectively, who are not in good physical shape and so on. So most people who've looked at it think it's really unlikely that it will add much to Russian fighting capacity in Ukraine. Yes, and I think the other problem is they seem to have been very quick to deploy some of these new conscripts to Ukraine, and some of them are already coming home in coffins. So a form of conscription has been introduced, but it hasn't worked out well at all.
Thank you.
Question?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Interesting that you define countries like Britain and America as democracies, whereas I would call them more democracies like this, whereas they maintain this image of democracy, but they use essentially all the same tools that these dictators use in their own state. Our own government, not necessarily the same level of fear, but still, these increasing powers act that was passed just the other day, or the time sentencing bill just a few months ago.
Thank you. Could you just very briefly summarise what he said so we can hear it on
The suggestion was that I'm drawing an excessively strong distinction between democracies and non-democracies. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't agree with that, actually. And my personal definition of a democracy is a country where you can't say in advance of the general election who's going to win it. That's really basic, but it seems to me a pretty good rule of thumb. And it seems to me there's absolutely no question that you can't tell who's going to win the next election in Britain or France or Germany or Chile or the USA and so on. I don't think there's any credible evidence that how you say you're going to vote in the next election is going to affect the police's attitude to you in this country. And I agree with you that the recent public order act that went through, was it last week, has got some worrying features to it. But that is quite different from saying that the agencies of the state are being systematically lined up in favour of one party rather than another. I wouldn't do that, personally. And as I say, I think if you compare Boris Johnson to a genuine authoritarian, he didn't put up a fight, did he? 62 ministers resigned, and within 24 hours he was gone. He didn't go to Graham Brady. He didn't say, find a way of changing the rules, I'm staying in power. He didn't attempt to prorogue Parliament again. He didn't try to say the Supreme Court got it wrong, I'm just going to do it anyway. So however unpleasant I certainly would never have got my vote. I think it's really important to remember that some people in this world are worse than others.
He's on his way back.
Well, that's right.
Yeah, I'm interested if do you have a view on how we're going to manage social media into the future? On the one hand, it's obviously an organ of free speech, a very important organ of free speech. But on the other hand, increasingly it's being used as a medium for spreading myth and for creating hardened views in the masses, which has been a tool which is being grasped by so many leaders in the free world as well as the closed world. And I just wonder how we're going to actually form the distinction between when we're going to draw the line between what we're going to allow and what we're not going to allow.
Yes, so the question is how we should manage social media to sort of minimise the negatives and accentuate the positives. I think that's really hard because we've seen social media playing a tremendously important role. And most of the frontline information that's come out of Syria over the last 7 years has come from people on Twitter. A huge amount that's coming out from Ukraine and from the ultra-nationalists in Russia who are criticising Putin from the right has come out on Telegram. And it's fantastic that everybody's got access to these and can put out all sorts of information. So a lot of the Russian mill bloggers have been reporting all the failures of the Russian Ministry of Defence. Now what I've tended to do recently is just go to Telegram, cut and paste the Cyrillic into Google Translate and read it. And I just think that's absolutely amazing. Within a few seconds I can read a first-hand account of someone in the backwoods of Siberia complaining about how the partial conscription has been mismanaged. Or I can look in more detail at what the Ukrainian Ministry of Defence is putting out. So there are enormous positives. And I think somehow we've got to try to find a way of preserving those positives whilst also finding it some way of controlling the misuse, the trolling, the advocacy of hatred and so on that also permeates internet connections. And I think to some extent the best hope is really to build up public confidence in certain institutions. The BBC, I think, has done a remarkably good job over the years of producing reliable information about all sorts of things all around the world. Organisations like Bellingcat, I think, do a tremendous work and a kind of forensic analysis of the internet to work out exactly what is happening and what the truth is. Lots of other organisations are trying to do those things, and somehow we need to spread the word about those and encourage more of them and get people to realise that organisations that employ fact-checkers tend to be more reliable than organisations that don't do so. But it's going to be a real dilemma. And I think that dilemma is evident when you look at attempts to control pornography on the internet and access for young people to pornography. Because on the one hand, most of us think, well, there ought to be some way of preventing children from seeing wholly inappropriate materials. Unfortunately, all the techniques that do that also seem to prevent the free access to really important information. So I don't have an answer, but it seems to me you're absolutely right in identifying that as a central challenge for politicians and technologists, definitely.
Another question.
I've been intrigued by the news unraveling today. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. But today I've been fascinated by the news bites that have been coming out, and two words that keep coming up consistently: authority and stability. And given your Chinese example, where you've got both in a way and increasing GDP, how do you translate that into a Western democracy, particularly in somewhere like NATO or the European Union, where countries of different sorts are having to work together, both economically and politically? So where does the authoritarian authority balance come in?
Yeah, I don't think there's an exact point where you can say it comes in, but I think underlying that, you're right, that in situations where there is less of a growing economic pie to share out, everything becomes much more difficult to do. That's certainly true. And we're seeing right now that although I think the EU and the UK are holding together a remarkably good united front against Russia, when it comes to allocating scarce gas, there are complaints. So there are people who are saying, for example, that the Germans are willing to pay too much and grab too large a part of it. There are people who are complaining that the Norwegians aren't pulling their weight. Why don't they provide more hydropower to the rest of us? There are people who are complaining that why aren't the French exporting nuclear electricity to the rest of us, and so on. So everything becomes more difficult. And when things become more difficult, simple solutions become more attractive. And as we know, simple solutions aren't really solutions, usually. It seems to me that Brexit is the classic example of that. It seems to me that most people who were voting for Brexit were expressing significant dissatisfaction with the general direction in which the British economy had been going, but they were simply picking the wrong target to blame.
Another question. Well, perhaps I could ask another one. Could you perhaps just tell us a little bit about Amnesty International and what they achieve and what we can do and whether we should join Amnesty International?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm always in favour of people joining Amnesty or taking action. So if you just go to Amnesty's website, amnesty.org.uk, there are always actions you can click on there. So you can, by email or just by clicking on various buttons, you can send messages of support to prisoners. You can send messages to governments saying prisoners of conscience should be released, torture should stop, death penalty shouldn't be carried out, and so on. There are lots of other human rights issues that Amnesty works on, and again you can contribute to those through the website. We do also have a small local group in Shrewsbury that meets monthly, that writes letters, that sends Christmas greetings cards to prisoners, that does a stalk outside the Unitarian Church most months, and so on. So anyone who would like details is very welcome to those. I think Amnesty's achieved a lot since it was established in 1961, I think it was, because it's raised the profile of human rights considerably. It was instrumental in several important developments in international law. So the creation of the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, Degrading Treatment in 1974, which was a really fundamental advance in human rights protection in international law. That came about very largely through persistent lobbying by Amnesty and having a lot of legal expertise to do the drafting and so on. Similarly, more recently, the UN Convention controlling the small arms trade, about 10 years ago now that came out, that was a significant piece of progress that was very, very much driven by Amnesty behind the scenes. So Amnesty works at the sort of micro level of working for individual people, so it works at the macro level, developing the rules-based international order. And Amnesty is very active in the primary bits of the United Nations that are devoted to human rights, such as the Human Rights Committee and so on, in really trying to use those mechanisms to hold countries to account. Thank you very much.
Could I just ask you, Peter, as far as Amnesty is concerned internationally, which are the countries that are really are very supportive of Amnesty, and how many countries are they not allowed to have any Amnesty?
I haven't got an exact number, but there obviously are countries. If we go back to my second slide, I think it was. So it's quite difficult for Amnesty to function in a number of these countries.
Could you say it?
Oh, sorry. Okay, so
I did, yeah.
well, first of all, China, Amnesty can't function in China. We used to have an office in Hong Kong and a national organisation in Hong Kong, but that's all been closed down. It's okay. So China is out of the question. A number of other countries like Venezuela, we really can't function there. We can't really function in Russia anymore. We used to have an office in Moscow, but the staff just got more and more harassed. In some really trivial but frustrating ways, the staff would find they'd arrive at the airport and just be asked to take a seat in the corner and just left there for hours and hours and hours. People would be waiting 7 or 8 hours. For no good reason other than to make life difficult. So there are a small number of countries where it's impossible for Amnesty to function, but in most countries some form of Amnesty presence is possible. In terms of how supportive governments are, in most of the North American, European, Australian, New Zealand, etc. countries generally are pretty supportive. Not when we criticise them, but in other areas. So by and large, the UK government has been supportive of Amnesty in lots of ways over the years, but of course, like any government, it doesn't like criticism. So when Amnesty produces a report on the UK, the government will complain about that. But if we say to the government, can we work with you? Well, for example, we had very good cooperation with the Department for International Development on the sorts of aid they were providing to some African countries and the sort of conditionality agreements that should be written into them in terms of human rights protections, improving governance and things like that. And the same is true with the EU. The Amnesties work closely with some parts of the EU, but when it comes to individual criticisms, of course, every country says, no, you're right in general, but you got it wrong for us.
Okay, so, just one more question.
I just wanted to add then, commend Amnesty's work with the on condemning Israel and apartheid of Palestine. I think that's probably one of the most significant.
Yes, so praising Amnesty's work, I think you're referring to the recent report, or a report earlier this year, in which Amnesty described the way the Israeli government is running the occupied territories as a form of apartheid. So that was carefully considered decision, took a long, long time to come to that decision, and Amnesty issued a very large report, it's several hundred pages long, that explains both the factual and the legal basis for deciding to use that language.
So, we have run out of time now, and in fact it is...
Good evening.
an honour.
I'm Simon Nightingale, Chair of Shropshire Humanists, and it is a great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, my friend Peter Pack. Peter has been a member of Amnesty International for over 43 years, and between 1991 and 2007 made a sustained contribution to the volunteer leadership of this international movement, including chairing the worldwide board during the 2007 and 2011 period. Since 1994, he has produced a monthly international issues newsletter on internal AI policy developments
that is circulated in many countries and translated into various languages. We're very fortunate to have him speaking to us this evening. Peter, welcome.